for Facebook Live now. Hi, speaking of Facebook Live, we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to 2021, and welcome to our first Legal Lunch and Learn of the year. So Legal Lunch and Learn is a weekly live show where we ask our expert your questions on a legal topic. My name is Cindy. I am the staff attorney here at Maryland Legal Aid. Today, we're having a little panel today. So our expert on RAD conversion, tenant rights, and all things housing authority related is our very own director of advocacy for housing and community economic development. I should have practiced that before we went live. And that is our own Gregory Countess. On the other panel, our other panelist is staff attorney Corey Warren from Disability Rights Maryland. And our co-host today is Charles Long, our own paralegal from Community Lawyering Initiative. Today's topic, of course, is RAD conversion and relocation resources for housing authority residents with a focus on people with disabilities. So if you do have questions on this topic, whether you are a tenant right now or you just want to learn more about what's going on and you are an attorney and you want to know how you can help, please send us a question in the comment down below. You can also direct message us on our Facebook page if you want to keep your identity confidential. And of course, if you do have an immediate legal issue, make sure you're contacting us. We will put our contact information down below for those who need it. Our email here is lawyer@mdlab.org. That's LAWYER@mdlab.org. Our phone number here is 443-451-2805. And for those who do need closed captions, we do upload these videos to YouTube afterwards for their auto-generated captions. And last but not least, as I say every single time, just because you take some legal advice from our presentation here, it does not establish an attorney-client relationship between you and any of the attorneys that you see here today or with Maryland Legal Aid. So again, if you do need one-on-one help, please make sure that you're contacting us. So with that out of the way, let's talk, go into our introductions with our panelists. So we do have two today. And since Corey, you are the guest at our organization, I'll let you go first. Do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Corey Warren. I am a community and civil rights inclusion attorney with Disability Rights Maryland. We are the congressionally mandated protection and advocacy organization for the state of Maryland. So basically our job is if you are a person with disabilities, our job is to do what we can to keep you out of institutional settings and keep them in the community with as much integration as possible. And we view fair housing justice as part of that, because if you don't have a place to live, we're trying to make sure you don't end up in a jail setting or a state hospital, and that, community services are the way to go. So we're here today because, hopefully we can provide some help, and RAD conversion is impacting everybody in Baltimore who's receiving subsidies. So hopefully we can give you some information today.
Yep, absolutely. And towards the end of the show, we'll also have you talk about the services that your organization do provide. So now let's go to Gregory, the authority on RAD conversion. Hi, Greg. Do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
I would, but first I would discount that authority on RAD conversion. I may be someone with some knowledge on it, and we've been dealing with this for a long period of time. But yes, my name is Gregory Countess again. I'm Director of Advocacy for Housing and Community Economic Development. Now, what does that mean? It means that for the most part, I advise staff. We attempt to sort of take a look at what some of the cutting edge issues may be, and in representing our clients, try to just address that, whether it may be through litigation or through other sorts of advocacy efforts. And generally, we represent tenants in the landlord tenant context. and other folks who reside in housing, rental housing, who may have problems that between uh, their landlord or problems that may be in the community. And so then that gets to the second part of my title, which is community economic development. And there, um, as I was describing to Cynthia a while ago, and this is a long title, it used to be called CED. And basically, it's a method or a means of addressing issues that affect a community. It's a process. And back when I came into legal aid, um, it was the community lawyering process. That is where attorneys attempted to go. We went out into the community, we listened to what folks were saying about their problems and issues, and we tried to provide advice to community groups and to help them to provide strategies in order to resolve issues and problems in their community.
Yeah, absolutely. Since you did mention community lawyering, so I am part of the community. Oh, geez, no one can say that word today. It's just one of those days. So I am a part of Maryland Legal Aid's community lawyering initiative. So pre-pandemic, of course, we did go into communities, and even now we're very involved in, for example, Legal Lunch and Learn is something that we're developing to try to, help spread knowledge. And I'm just so grateful to have both of you on here today. So let's dive into our topic. Let's start with talking about what is RAG conversion. I think this is a term not even all attorneys are familiar with. So let's talk about, before we get into all the problems it has, let's talk about how is this supposed to work? Why is this a thing? And either one of you feel free to jump in.
So the Rental Assistance Demonstration Project is an effort that was originated under the Obama administration to address what were sort of the problems, conditions, the lack of financial capital and resources to address the capital needs. And by capital, I mean the money needs of housing authorities in regard to their management and ownership of public housing. The program, so what we're talking about is a financing program in reality that has some regulatory impact because it changes that housing. Doesn't have to, but it has resulted in changing that housing from what was public housing to what is another program run by HUD, which is its privately owned, federally subsidized housing program. The way the program is designed, there are minimal changes as it affects the amount of rent that someone may owe. Rent is still based on 30% of a person's adjusted gross income. The most profound effect may be, and I'm going to keep saying may, because it depends upon how the public housing agency decides to apply the program. It may result in the loss of some rights that tenants may have in public housing, but then again, it may not. It depends upon how the public housing authority decides to to uh, 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 to use the program in order to get those capital funds, in order to make the improvements that they make to their public housing units or inventory. And just to give you an example, in the city of Baltimore, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City claimed that it had around $850 million in capital need. And by that, what they meant was in some of the high rises, you had elevators that did not operate. And in those high rise buildings, which were typically, and Corey can speak to this, which are typically used to house people who are elderly and disabled. They call them mixed population buildings. Many of them are 20 stories and more. And so you can imagine if you don't have an elevator in one of these mixed population buildings, then people are not going to be able to either one, if they go out, get into their homes, or two, if they're in their homes, get out of their homes and out of the building in order to take care of their affairs, whether it be grocery shopping or doctor appointments, or just going about and visiting friends and getting out into the neighborhood. And so, and this sort of manifests itself over a number of different issues. For instance, in Perkins Homes, which people are talking about now, the system is heated with steam. Folks also get their hot water through some of those from the steam heating boilers that give folks hot water. And so it's an underground system. It's failing now. And in order to replace it, would cost the housing authority estimates somewhere in the vicinity of $15 to $20 million. And then you would still have other problems, for instance, that are endemic to Perkins Homes: rodent infestation, sub-basements that are dirt, which lead and can breed those sort of issues and problems. And you know that Perkins is near the waterfront. And once when I was young in Baltimore City, I lived in a waterfront community. And I can tell you that there would be rats as big as cats running around in the neighborhood.
I think there still are. I think there still are.
Those are some of the issues that RAD was put in place to address. And I think the important thing to remember is it depends upon how the housing authority decides to enact the program.
So it does, correct me if I'm wrong, and I will be the first one to tell you I am not very knowledgeable on this topic at all. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the housing authority is privatizing these homes. Is that about right? Or
that's basically the long and short of it. So for the folks listening in who do live in properties going through conversion, the biggest thing you're really going to see is your building's under new management, and it's going to be a private company coming in who's running the process. So one of the bigger conversions we've seen in Baltimore that's more or less completed, although they're still doing work in the building, was J Van Story Branch, which on 20th Street, which is a pretty big, mostly senior high rise in central Baltimore. So,
so we all know the issues of having privately run, I guess, public services, the issues that may arise from that, as we have learned from our prison system. But so I do see on the news that things are going wrong with this conversion. Can either one of you talk to me about, how it's impacting Baltimore and what are the things that's going wrong and how it's hurting potentially the residents?
So if we're talking about Baltimore, I mean, we're talking again, as I said, it depends upon how the housing authority decides that they're going to enact the program. For instance, if you go to Anne Arundel County, which is also undergoing a RAD conversion, then you'll find that the housing authority there decided that it would form the private company. In other words, the private company would be a subsidiary of the housing authority in the county of Annapolis. But because of there are certain financial technical aspects of this. I don't know if folks want to go into all of those weeds, but because in many cases, a lot of these conversions use what's called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, because it's one of the only programs that's available to subsidize private housing, or excuse me, subsidized housing, then a lot of these conversions are going to involve private companies. However, as folks know, there's a difference in the company or private company. And it can be, and it depends upon what their mission is. So in many instances, a lot of these private companies are nonprofits that are involved in affordable housing. Some are not, some are for profit developers. As I said, in Montgomery and Anne Arundel County, the company, the general partner or the controlling managing entity and the limited liability company is a company that is an affiliate or a subsidiary of the housing authority. In Baltimore City, what they decided to do was to get bids from private companies because um, they decided to convert, at least initially, over 4,000 units. And now they're using that conversion process probably for Perkins Home and Park and for Poe and perhaps for Gilmore. So, but again, the thing to remember is this, folks condemn this, but the fact of the matter is, and this is the historical perspective and the present perspective that everybody should have, the federal government has underfunded the housing authority since the 1970s. So for the last 50 years, even though policymakers knew that there were needs, these capital needs, these needs to take care of maintenance and ongoing maintenance and renovation, because some of these buildings are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, they had to put funding, they had to appropriate funding in order to properly run the housing authority. And since these properties, for the most part, house brown and Black people, predominantly African American people, then they have not been properly funded for the last 50 years. And so what you have then, unless Congress appropriates the funds needed in order to make the repairs that are necessary, and what you have is a cesspool, really, that folks, in some cases, literally a cesspool that folks are living in, unless you had the financial wherewithal or the program in order to address those pressing housing conditions and needs. So,
Sorry.
that's what
Yep. So something that we do want to do on this program is really talk to people who are potentially in these, horrible conditions and talk to them about what their rights are if their building's converted. So let's shift perspective a little bit. And Corey, feel free to jump in because this was your idea to begin with.
Sure.
Yeah, so if, let's say if I am someone in a building that's been converted, what's going on here? Does it just happen and I get a letter and that's it, or what's the process?
So Greg might be able to speak to the exact process of notice and community meetings. But there generally is, you are given a notice. There usually is an opportunity for tenants to talk. Obviously, I would highly encourage, if you are a tenant in one of these buildings and you have concerns, tenant organizing is a great way to get you and your neighbors together, to have many voices being able to speak to, the management of your property. Now, there's also one other right that I should bring up is if you are in a RAD converted property, the amount of time is going to be based on what the housing authority says for this. But generally speaking, Baltimore City has done 2 years. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Greg. It's generally if you've been in the RAD converted property for 2 years and you're like, this is not working out for me, you can apply to the housing authority for what's called a tenant-based voucher, which is a voucher you can take on the private market. So, I've had a few clients who were in these RAD converted properties and they didn't have a great experience, so they went to their management, said, I wanted to apply for tenant-based voucher. I'd rather go on the private market. So that's one option if you're in the building and it's just not working out. So Baltimore City is allowing that. I believe you do have to kind of suck it up and live there for 2 years. But I do need to check on that timeline. The other thing is, and I kind of wanted to jump off of what Greg was talking about with conditions, which is, if you are in any type of building or facility that is receiving federal or state funds, you have the right to make reasonable accommodation requests and reasonable modification requests under the Fair Housing Act, as well as the American Disabilities Act. And so the definition of a reasonable accommodation is it is a change in rule or policy in order to accommodate your disability so that you can have equal access to the enjoyment of your building and your unit, because your disability otherwise is impacting one or more life activities. So if you are in a unit that does not have, if you are in a RAD converted building and it is not accessible to you, you have the right to make an accommodation request with your management and with the housing authority, and they need to figure out a way with you that to make your participation in the subsidized housing program accessible to you as a person with disabilities. So if you're in a building and you use a wheelchair and your unit is not wheelchair accessible, you have every right to complain to your management and complain to the housing authority saying, you need to get me in a unit that is wheelchair accessible, or give me the option of going on the private market and finding a wheelchair accessible unit. So that's an accommodation. Now, there also is a concept of called reasonable modifications. This is, you have something in your unit and you want to modify it, So the big example we get to see all the time is called grab bars. If you have some physical disability and it makes it difficult for you to take a bath and get out of the bathtub, you can call up the housing authority or your management and say, listen, I need these grab bars installed. Now, the question is, and this is always the question that comes after that, is who's going to pay for it? So if public housing doesn't apply to you at all and you're on the private market, you're kind of stuck paying for it yourself. If you're in Baltimore City, though, there is a modification fund program. So if you are a participant in a program being run by the housing authority, including RAD converted projects, there is a fund you can apply to get that modification in your unit done. And that money's just sitting there for this purpose. Make Baltimore City pay for it. It's the tax money everybody's been paying for. So if you need grab bars, apply for that fund.
Yep. So hopping back just a tiny bit, in terms of relocation though, what happens if, so actually hopping back a little more, because we did say that we want tenants to participate in the RAD conversion to begin with. Does the tenant have any say in it? What if you go to a meeting and say, I don't want this to happen? Like, is there anything that, housing authority can do, or are they going to ignore you and convert the house, your building anyway?
Cindy, again, I think that it is really important for the audience to understand that RAD conversion is a program to help to address the problems in public housing. Because in the 1990s, Congress passed as a part of a bill, right, that sort of governed the housing authority, a provision, an amendment that prevented housing authorities from building new public housing. Couple that with the underfunding, and again, I keep saying this, and I think it's really important for people to hear it. The underfunding, by that I meant they starved public housing in the United States of America. And understand who it housed. African Americans, poor brown folks, poor white folks. And so it is a deliberately, right? And it's as if the United States government decided that housing that would be affordable for poor people, public housing, would be in a shambles, that it would be a cesspool. So this program helps to alleviate and to address some of those issues until there is congressional will to totally reform and fund public housing and to go back and say, hey, what they did in the 1930s was a great idea, that we provide housing for people that is affordable to them. Until that is again a priority in the United States of America, then we will have this problem. Now, addressing your issue, of course, all of the RAD buildings that have converted to RAD in the city of Baltimore, because they were public housing buildings, have tenant councils. People should participate in their tenant councils. And why should they? Because the citywide coalition of tenant councils back in 2011, 2012, when this was coming and mentioned coming down the pipe, decided that they were going to negotiate with the housing authority to say, this is not going to be like other privately owned, federally subsidized buildings. We want these buildings to become what is public housing like. And what does that mean? It means the rights that tenants had in public housing buildings should be transferred to these RAD buildings, and that there should be a legal mechanism for tenants to enforce their rights. Now, folks worked on this. This RAD, Resident Advisory Board, worked on this for years. They've set up the infrastructure so that can occur. But here's the thing that everybody on this call should know. If you don't use your rights, you lose your rights. And so there are rights available to folks who reside in RAD buildings, but the use of those, but the ability to use that to protect yourself depends in many instances upon the ability of the tenant councils, which is a coalition of all the tenants, to make sure those that the rights that are embedded in this program, as applied in Baltimore City, are in fact applied to tenants. Now, you can do it by a case-by-case basis. What I'm saying, and this is the community economic development, community luring part of me saying, that if folks work together, then they are able to move the situation, the needle, perhaps more than they can in working on their own. And so we can discuss all of this again in terms of, what are the, what are the deficits in the RAD program? I'm not going to disagree. I would prefer that, in fact, all of this housing be publicly owned, that there be an agency, as the public housing authorities in the state of Maryland are supposed to be institutions that look after those folks that are in need of housing and who are the most vulnerable. And it happens to be sometimes the same mission of some of these nonprofits, but in many cases, you're depending upon individuals in those companies. When you have a public housing authority, it is in fact governed by a set of rules, and there's interest by residents in being able to ensure that those housing authorities, obey their rules. And so, that's sort of what we have a hybrid of in the RAD program. It's not perfect, but, folks fought to get that. And so folks should take advantage of it.
Yep, absolutely. So speaking of, everyone working together, let's talk about some of the resources that's available from both of our organizations. Corey, you're the guest. I'll let you go first. So my question is, what kind, let's just say under what circumstances should people go to Disability Rights Maryland, and what kind of help can you provide? And then we'll turn to Greg with the same question. So Corey?
Sure. So we have the fun position of being in, where we both do systemic work, and as well as individual cases. So if you feel like you have been discriminated in housing because of your disability, you've been denied a reasonable accommodation, you're being evicted because of your disability, or if you think that you've been discriminated and it's tied to some type of symptom of your disability, call us. We're happy to do an intake. If we're not the right people, we'll make sure you get referred out. But generally speaking, we're here to prevent discrimination against persons with disabilities. So if that's what's going on with you, please reach out. Our intake number is 410-727-6352.
Thanks. And Greg?
Again, I mean, we have attorneys available to represent folks in their individual cases. One of the reasons why one of my portfolios as a director of advocacy in my particular where I am is, again, the community economic development sort of arm. So, for instance, we had one of the tenant councils use the RAD process to secure ownership of the community room. In fact, the entire building that houses the management office. Now, why was that helpful? Well, it was helpful to them because they had a mission to deliver services to their residents, to provide a space where folks could meet, where they could celebrate things like birthdays and anniversaries and even mourn. And so they used this RAD process and leverage they had because this was previously a Hope 6 project to gain control of that building. And that was only done because the tenant council was organized enough in order to assert their rights, to use their leverage in this particular process. So one of the things I talk to all of my clients and client groups about is leverage. Where is it? How do you assert it to get what it is that you as a community of residents decide is important to you? And so those are the sort of services that we have available to try to assist tenants to make the housing that they live in their homes, to be able to exert some control over where it is they live and how those housing services are delivered. And there are many other instances, but we've got a limited amount of time in this program.
Yep, absolutely. So folks should just reach out to us if you have specific questions. Actually, Greg, I don't know the answer to this. Does Maryland Legal Aid represent tenant council, or are we more of an advisory position on that?
No, we represent tenant councils
Yep.
throughout the state. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so definitely give us a call. So that's all the main questions that I have for today. Now let's turn to Charlie with questions from the audiences.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me fine? Cool.
Yes.
All right. So a few questions we have so far. If someone has suffered health issues as a result of public housing conditions such as mold, are there legal channels for compensation?
So that may be something you're going to want to speak to individually with an attorney based on the specific facts, but you're absolutely free to call DRM. We're happy to intake and see if we would be appropriate.
So the answer to that is yes. And Legal Aid has also represented folks in cases. We talked about relocation before, and we represent them in fair housing cases that may involve the failure of a housing authority to transfer someone because of conditions and also because of the way that the particular unit is constructed. And we've won damages, but normally that's not what it is we do, and Corey is correct. Usually we refer those cases out to private lawyers. And the reason why we do that is because we receive funds from the federal a federal program that has placed restrictions upon our ability to take what are called fee generating types of cases. And that's what these fall into that particular category. We first have to refer folks to private counsel, and before we can even take a look at those cases. So yes, that is available to folks. In answer to the question.
And Disability Rights Maryland has a little more wiggle room in taking fee generating cases than Maryland Legal Aid based on our grants. So feel free to call us.
Charles, we can't hear you.
There it is. Okay. If my building goes under RAD conversion, will my rent change? Do I have to sign a new lease?
So your rent should not change. And yes, you will. If you're living in a building that was owned by the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, then yes, you will have to sign a new lease. You know, those leases, though, are based in part on a federal model. That is, and that model, in fact, is one that HUD has provided for privately owned, federally subsidized housing, but it has to be amended to include some of the provisions that the Resident Advisory Board for Baltimore City negotiated with the Housing Authority of Baltimore City to be included in those leases.
Yeah, there hasn't been a change to how the tenant portion of rent's going to be calculated. But if you do see something drastically different after your next certification, I would definitely encourage you to reach out.
All right. Will RAD conversions affect my housing assistance is one of the questions that keeps coming up that might have been answered a little bit already.
So if what they mean is will it affect the type of subsidy that you receive? The answer to that is yes. But will it affect, as you just said in the prior question, will it affect your rent? No. Will it affect things like if you have a problem with the landlord and you want to get that problem resolved? In public housing, there's an extensive sort of informal, formal grievance process, which is really important for residents who live in these buildings to take advantage of. And that program, I mean, that grievance, that informal grievance, formal grievance opportunity is directly corresponded to or equal to, in fact, almost the same as the public housing informal, formal grievance program. And what that does is allows you to get a problem resolved without going to court. And that's really important.
Okay. How do I know if my building is being converted ahead of time, and can I have a say in it before the conversion happens?
So there are notice provisions that all housing authorities have to follow before they involve themselves in a RAD conversion process. There has to be at least, I believe, 2 meetings that are held with tenants and with the tenant council. And all of this is the reason why I said that folks need to be really involved in the tenant councils that they have in each one of the public housing developments that they live in, both so that they can have knowledge of what's coming down the pike, and 2, so that they can influence, perhaps even with their one vote, the way that their tenant council decides to approach a RAD conversion.
This kind of goes along with the previous question, I suppose. If the building goes under RAD conversion and they start to rehab the building, does a person have to move?
So the building's going to be required to help you relocate oh goodness. So if you are in the RAD conversion process and they're doing a rehab, there is a requirement that you receive assistance in temporarily relocating, but you will have the right to return to your unit.
And so again, I mean, I'll chime back in again with this, and I'm going to sound like a broken record. They're going to say, "Why does Greg Callis keep talking about tenant councils and stuff like that?" And that's because when we have been involved, we've been involved with the RAB, and when tenant councils have called us in, if they've called us in, then one of the things that tenant councils are and tenants are in those councils are concerned about is the relocation process. And so one of the things that we've been involved in is helping the tenants to demand that there be a relocation process that's put in writing, one that tenants had input into attempting to shape. And so, yes, yeah, you have the right, as Corey said, you do have the right to return. However, some folks don't want that, and some tenants in some buildings wanted, depending upon the extent of the renovations that are going to take place in each of their individual units, some people wanted to sort of stay in place and have the renovations occur while they were there. Some thought that was an imposition and wanted to have the ability to move temporarily to places within the building and then move back to their original units. All of that can be and should be determined by what you and your fellow residents in that building or in that property want to take place. And that relocation plan should be in writing so that you know what's required of you and you know what's required of the owner. And if there's a violation of that, then you have the ability to be able to stop that particular violation because all this stuff is in writing.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump on off of that. One of the big things we've heard complaints from people is that during the relocation process, somebody who needed an accessible unit was placed in a unit that was not accessible to them during the temporary relocation. So if you are concerned about that, I would be bringing that up with the management in writing as soon as possible to make sure that if you are temporarily relocating me out of my unit, I have X, Y, and Z needs because of my disability. You need to accommodate this and you need to create a record of that, because if they are temporarily relocating you, that does not cut out your rights to an accessible unit and your right, to be able to enjoy that unit. Once again, this is kind of what our organization handles. So if you've been temporarily relocated into a unit that is not accessible, call us because we would genuinely be interested in talking to you further about that.
It looks like the rest of the questions have a lot to do with that sort of same thing. Questions like, if I have to move temporarily, should I get this, or will I be allowed to get the same size of apartment? I guess that goes along with accessibility as well, or getting these things in writing, or what does it mean for my ability to choose where to live? Do you think those questions fall under the same topic that you two just discussed?
So here's the issue, and I think many residents of public housing probably know. There are residents who are housed appropriately, whether it be because of they're in a unit that accommodates their disability, or that are sized correctly. That is, they are not overhoused, but in some cases they are overhoused. In other words, they have more bedrooms than the family needs. And in some cases, you have folks who are underhoused. That is, they are living in units which don't have enough bedrooms available for the size of the family. And so all of these questions, when you say to someone, well, can I move back to the unit that I'm living in if I'm living in public housing? All of that sort of depends, right? Because under federal law, even a public housing authority, they may not have enforced it, are required to put people in the appropriate sized units. And in many cases, because you don't have a housing authority, for instance, folks may need a 5-bedroom unit. There are a smattering of 5-bedroom units in the city, in the housing authority inventory. So you're going to have many people who are underhoused in that particular instance. And so if you are living, for instance, in a 5-bedroom unit, and there are only 3 members of your family there, then you are overhoused. And so if you go through this RAD conversion process, the owner of the building may require you to move to an appropriately sized unit so they can move someone else into a unit that would fit that particular family. But generally, if you're in a unit that's appropriately sized for your family, yes, not only will you be able to move back to the unit that you resided in, if you didn't want that particular unit, you'll be moved to a unit that is appropriately sized where you should be. You have the right to be.
Okay, I think there's just one last question before we turn it back over to Cindy. The last question was, are there, for getting the tenant community together to go over the things that need to be discussed for the community while things are going through RAD conversions, are there things that need to be done legally? Do people just gather and say, hey, this is what we're doing and how we're doing it, and put it in writing?
So the housing authority is required to give notice to residents that they are going through a RAD conversion process. As I said, I believe there are at least 2 notices that are given. One that gives the folks the opportunity to meet with the housing authority when they have some discussion about whether it should be RAD or they should not go through RAD. A housing authority normally is going to, again, and I really want people to understand this process. People paint RAD as the devil. Oh my God, here comes RAD. The fact of the matter is, and again, I'm going to say to folks, so that folks understand, unless Congress appropriates the funds that are necessary so that public housing conditions can be met, remedied, there can be a redevelopment of public housing, the only game in town is RAD. And so if you insist that a housing authority not go through RAD, then it seems to me you better be a part of a movement if you don't want to live, again, as I said, in some of these cesspools that are, in fact, in some cases, public housing, or maybe not. Maybe it's okay, it's pretty middling and you can get along with it. Then you ought to be a part of a movement that says to Congress, you need to adequately fund the capital needs of public housing. And I'm going to continue to pound on that particular message because I think that the enemy is not RAD. The enemy is the fact that public housing has been starved for funds for over 50 years. And the place that you currently live in shouldn't have to look the way that it is. It should be safe, decent, and sanitary. And under the present public housing regime, it's almost impossible for that to occur.
All right, it looks like that was our final question. We can go back to Cindy for some closing remarks.
Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg, for that speech. It's very moving and I absolutely love it. And thank you, Corey, for coming on to talk to us about the available resources that Disability Rights Maryland can provide. So dear viewers, next week, we're going to talk about stimulus checks. So if you do have a question and want to make sure that your question get answered on air, please leave a comment down below or email us. And of course, if you do like this video and like what we had to say, remember to share and subscribe to Maryland Legal Aid. Like our Facebook page. With that said, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next Tuesday at noon.